Good afternoon, all. Hope you're all well. Hope you can all hear me. As you will notice, this is the first remote chewing it over. I didn't want to miss a show because we missed Monday because we had some technical issues and I was on the road coming back from Centre Parks with my family. Whereas we got some great news very recently that my sister has had her firstborn. So I'm an uncle for the first time. Those of you that don't know, I'm a dad of twins that are 9 months old. Just turned 9 months old on my birthday, and so it's great for them to have a little cousin. So we're just visiting my new niece Polly, and so we're just bringing you half an hour live from their house. So probably I'll have to check the rules these days. Probably highly illegal for me to be visiting my newborn niece. However, of course, I was in full PPE and taking all the relevant precautions, or not. But anyway, I wasn't going to miss that. So, hope you can hear me. Do give us a shout if you can. Got a couple of exciting bits of news for you with regards to Therapy Live Sport, as well as wanting to discuss with you something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, which is what's happened in the last 10 years, and I'll come to why that is in a second. But do shout out if you can hear me okay. Let me know. It's always important, especially as far as I can tell, signal's okay. In fact, it's probably better here than it is in the studio, but not got the fancy microphone, so please do let me know as long as you can hear. Many thanks to those of you that tuned in yesterday, and some brilliant feedback and comments with regards to the chat that I had with Adam Dobson, including from Jonathan Bell, and I think that's really interesting. You know, we're going to be able to keep conversations like that going, reflections on a recent podcast. Question I want to ask you guys that are tuning in live, seeing that it's ticking up now. As I said before, I think we sort of get somewhere between 25 and 50 seems to be the range. It's hard to know because you don't always get a live read as to who's tuning in from where. But then also we get up to between 800 and 1,000 over the course of a 24-hour period. So really pleased to hear from people that weren't necessarily watching live but listen on their way home from work or on their way back into work. Hi to Scarsbrook, who's saying he likes the change of scenery. Yeah, it's not quite as, don't mess with your eyes as much as the cardboard boxes, egg boxes that are behind me on the studio. Hi Martin, coming in from Nairobi. You can hear me loud and clear. That's brilliant. Thank you so much. But amusingly, he's saying on his lunch break. I don't know what the time zone is, but I imagine he's joking with me there. Matt's made the great point that, of course, that they've conveniently painted the wall Choose Health colours. It's the only way. I wouldn't be here otherwise. They know that I'd just snub the house forever and a day if it wasn't in the appropriate colours, for just in case I ever did a show like this from here. So what I want to ask you guys, I want you to be thinking about. I'm going to muse on this for a second, for a few seconds, I'd say. But I want to ask you guys what you feel has changed over the last 10 years. Be that in MSK practice, be that in wider healthcare, be that in education, the things that I'm most passionate about, but also reflecting on how the world's changed in the last 10 years, for better or worse. What reforms, what changes, what you're pleased with, what are you not? And the reason for that is that I reflected on this the other day, that it was my 32nd birthday on Sunday, which wouldn't normally even register, if I'm honest. I wouldn't even be giving it much thought. But it so happens that I coincidentally started my career on my 22nd birthday, right? It was my 22nd birthday. It was my first day of work, first Monday in my first Band 5 job in a hospital down in Kent, in Margate, in fact. So if anyone's listening that knew me from back then, please don't tell too many stories, but nice to hear that you're hearing me. But so that means that then on my 32nd birthday, it was then 10 years that I've been practicing as a physio, most of that, of course, in MSK. But it got me to thinking, what's changed, what hasn't, what should have done. Also thinking about what contributions I've been able to make, what changes that I've tried to inspire, for good and for ill, as well as then just broadly, because I'm sad and I'm deep, then thinking about what other things have changed, for better or worse, over the course of that 10-year period. You know, the world has shifted in many different ways and back and forth since then. And so I really want to ask you guys as to what your thoughts are, especially if you can give us your take on whether or not you think it's been for better or for worse in each of those areas: MSK, healthcare generally, education generally, and then of course in current affairs or in the world, let's say, just in general terms, whether we're in a better place or not. That would be really valuable. For example, and we're coming back to the comments. I'm going to take my eye off them for a second, but I'm going to come back to them. But this is a great example. So thanks, Tommy Thomas. Great name, by the way, Tommy Thomas. I think he's joining us on LinkedIn from what it tells me. He said MSK, no electrotherapy. Yeah, that's a real relevant change, actually. I think it's a good point that Tommy's making there, in that you're going to have quite a significant shift in styles of practice, modalities that are coming in and out. But interestingly, I'd say no electrotherapy. I'd say that certainly therapeutic ultrasound is certainly not as en vogue as it was. However, we're seeing things like shockwave or neuromuscular stimulation and other types of modalities that are actually increasingly on vogue, which is interesting. So I would say, those are the sorts of reflections I'm keen to hear from you on, as to what has gone on over the last 10 years. What are the changes, whether you think that they're for better or for worse. So do get your comments in. I'll be coming back to them shortly. But first, my sort of take on the matter. I think that it sort of weirds me out a little bit. It feels, in many ways, like I've been in the game for longer than 10 years. I think it's because of the rate of which I've practiced. And so pretty much straight out of the gates, I was doing 50, 55-hour weeks, particularly as a clinician, pretty early doors. And that has meant that to some extent, I feel like I've been on a real roller coaster, on a journey. I know many people do the same, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that makes it especially unique, but particularly once I was really into MSK and sport practice, I was just getting as much experience as I can, getting my hands over and as many bodies as I can in various different contexts. And so it feels like, it just amazes me, 10 years, it feels like 30. And maybe that's partly as well, because it feels like I've exhausted myself in many ways and gone through many things that I've been enthusiastically poured myself into. And had some utopian expectations of what could change, and then it hasn't done and stuff. And so there's maybe some reflection for me to think that potentially some mistakes have been made that might have meant that I look on at my 10 years and think it feels like more like 30, feel a bit war weary in some certain circumstances. And then other ways I feel energized and inspired in more ways than ever. Now, one of the things that Tommy brought up is these styles of practice that have changed. Now, that seems super relevant. So when we think about MSK, I think about the landscape of which I qualified into and what I was experiencing when I first started going, it felt like the edge of practice was a person-centered, biopsychosocial education and rehab style of care. That style of care delivery felt like that was almost that was a bit of a niche. That was what those that work more with persistent pain were doing. It was still considered to be the standard care was special tests on assessment, trying to use your subjective and objective assessments to give quite pathoanatomical structural diagnoses, or to move people into categorical boxes of diagnostics, especially when I think about MSK, which is where I'm going straight away. And then over the 10 years, I would say that now, I'd hope that 10 years ago, gold standard should have been, when it comes to what a sensible reading of the evidence back then was. But I'm saying that I would say, throw a dart in an MSK department in the UK now, and you should have the standard practice being the way in which people now biopsychosocially consider all the factors affecting and dispositions associated to someone's pain experience. Rehab hopefully being sort of a core thing that runs through their care, and then modalities being more adjunctive, and that people aren't necessarily wanting to pigeonhole and categorically think into diagnostics. Now, this is where it's frustrating, because I kind of end up with these two things that I'm balancing in my mind, and I'm really keen to hear your thoughts as to. Some days I think over 10 years we definitely have moved in the right direction. However, I think it's a naive reading, even from me, to suggest that then, maybe 20% of care was like that back then, and now 20% of care is actually the opposite, and it's shifted the majority in such a significant way. I would say that the vast majority still Vast majority feels a bit much, actually, but I'd say that maybe now 50-50-ish, but you've still got people that across MSK practice in various different disciplines are still actually aspiring someone to a tissue-based diagnosis and using modalities in a way that are sort of central to the care delivery of treatment, and that the rehab is almost bolted on and not necessarily the center, the education and rehab not being the center of the care delivery. I'd probably say that that's still there, but I'd say that the voice of, it's not a niche voice, right? The idea that we've now got functional graded rehabilitation at the heart of care delivery is not a niche voice, particularly when it comes to educational spaces such as this one, which I will definitely come to as well. So you've got that in MSK. I would say we've moved away from being sort of really modality driven, where people have their favorite style of care. You've got your manual therapists, your electrotherapists, your people that use tape, especially your acupuncturists, your Pilates instructor style care. I mean, you've still got all that existing, but it's more of a melting pot, I think, as standard now, and that people aren't necessarily as defined by those roles. You don't hear people introduce themselves into that as being their core care delivery as much anymore, I would say. In healthcare in general, I would say we've gone through a really interesting shift in that 10 years. I think one of the big things that it was happening, but it's kind of not necessarily accelerated, but become a real key talking point in UK healthcare is within the NHS, you've got sort of commissioned services, whereby you've got independent sector provisions within the NHS. And that was happening longer than 10 years ago, don't get me wrong. But it's just something that's become more relevant, especially in the field of MSK practice and the care delivery of MSK services in the UK. And my sort of take on this, and something we'll chew over in future episodes, is that I'm actually a really big fan of anything that creates sensible independence in that sector. And so I'm actually I'm a really big fan of commissioned services, regardless who delivers them, be that NHS trusts or independent providers or charitable trusts or non-profit social enterprises. You know, I've got great examples of practice that exist across it. But I would say that one of my core reflections over what's happened in the 10 years is that that's become something that we should all be more thoughtful about, and that the way that influences policy, the way that maps onto people's politics, the way that seems to make a real difference. I would say that has been a key change, and I'm admitting to you that I would say that has been a negative. Sorry, I would say that has been a positive shift, whereas many would infer that is inherently negative. And we can unpack that another time, or if your comments are coming on in that direction, you want me to go further on that, I will explain it. But I would say that's been a core shift in healthcare that maps onto MSK to some extent, but isn't central to it. And I would say that that's a positive thing. There's some caveats to that. I think it's done really poorly in some circumstances. And when generalist services try to then reach into specialist ones, or generic large organizations try to then flex into what need to be more specialized in niche areas, I think it's done terribly. Those things I think are better suited as nationalized enterprises. But in a general rule, especially where it joins MSK, I think of great examples of social enterprises and independent sector providers and charitable providers giving services that are in excess of the quality that was delivered by that local primary care trust, as they were then, or whatever it might be, that was the standard NHS provision that was sort of all centralised through the state. So that's my take on that. Education was the fourth area. So I said MSK, healthcare, education. In education, I found that to be the most fascinating thing, and I think that's changed. I think it's unrecognisable now, broadly, education across all things that I'm interested in, and I mean outside of healthcare now as well. But the way in which over the 10 years, the podcast revolution, of course, I've been involved in, but just the way in which the advent and utility of social media. So even things like Facebook, right? When I went to university from 2007 to 2010. So 13 years ago to 10 years ago, I was at university, and I remember my sister setting me up a Facebook account as I went to university, and you needed a university login at that point to get on there and stuff. It was kind of around then. It hadn't really exponentially grown. And when we were at university, you had things like Anatomy TV, where you had some rudimentary styles of moving anatomical models around on your laptop screen, but you certainly didn't have a smartphone until I was in my third year. At the end of my third year, I remember getting an iPhone. So it's the massive rate of change in that 10-year period about the way in which we understand things. And if I'm loosely calling it education, but the ability to Google something if you've got a question on your phone, you'd probably extend that to sort of 15 years. But generally speaking, I would say, 10 years, the massive changes, including the fact that I now live stream this to 7 different channels simultaneously on a daily basis at weekdays. Is a massive change. And not that necessarily this is education heavy, obviously more commentary and things like that, but just a fascinating shift. And I would say that especially with what's happened around COVID, and you can hold me to this, education and delivery of it from institutional levels at schools and universities, etc., and the credentialing that's going to need to shift from that, and the placement to clinical education, as well as CPD related education, which I'm very involved in, CPD events such as Therapy Live, which we'll talk about in a little while. I just don't think that the way that the landscape shifted is never going back, and the way, if you span that over 10 years, even we could say over 2 years, but over 10 years, it's just changed, and it will never be the same again. Now, when it comes to the world stuff, the big reflection for me is that there's been huge shifts of various different forms over the course of time. Politically, we could talk about, or just socially and culturally and things like that. Some brilliant changes that have occurred in many ways in terms of rights claims and things like that. I'm a strong supporter personally of sort of gay marriage and the way in which that came in, and the way that to legislate equality of access and opportunities was an exciting threshold for me, to feel that it was, especially on a legal doctrinal level, it felt like another area in which we really sort of tidied up human rights in many ways. There's been other shifts, of course, politically, that are more polarizing over that 10 years, but it's just been a fascinating time. Some scary stuff going on at the moment, as to something I'm sure we'll end up talking about in coming shows, really, about how it all tidies up, and what you try to conserve and what you try to reform, and how quickly that can be done, and the sort of culture wars piece of it, as well as for my American listeners, there's all sorts of turbulence going on at the moment in and around your politics, and so it's a really challenging time. But that's obviously, it feels like it's recent, but you look at over the 10 years of what that's brought, it just feels like a fascinating time to have been alive, and a time for me to have been shaping my career. For those just tuning in, then I'm reflecting on 10 years in practice. So on my 32nd birthday, that signified 10 years from my 22nd birthday, which was my first day of my first job. That's what we're reflecting on now. So let me have a little look at the chat box and see if any of you shared any of your thoughts and comments. Really interested in your opinions on this. So thank you so much for those of you that are commenting. And if you're listening to this after the fact, then please do share your comments. I'd be really interested in your thoughts over what has and hasn't changed across various different things over the last 10 years. And then we'll do this for a few minutes, have a look at some of your comments, and then we'll get on to some Therapy Live leaks, which I've got to share with you, some of the speakers and sessions that we've got planned, because it's really exciting. Only a few tickets of that left as well. This is brilliant, and definitely something I hear a lot of. Katie Napton has said everything goes in cycles, especially if you've been around long enough. Certainly, I feel like I've seen that in 10 years, but certainly those that tell me a lot about it or show me training materials and things like that from where things do come back around and stuff. I've witnessed it, but I've also heard plenty of it as well. I found that to be really interesting, and I wonder what has been out the window that's now going to come back in. I'm really interested what feel free to share that as well, especially Katie, if you've got any ideas as to what's been scrapped that will come back in, and whether that's for good or bad. Tommy Thomas, we're doing more CBT approaches in chronic pain management, special tests in terms of evidence-based practice. I think are no more special. I think stuff like that I see that as being a key thing in the last 10 years, especially when you think about the shoulder. That was where there were 101 special tests, and the way in which and I tap complete hat tip for me to what Jeremy Lewis did to really blow the lid off the notion of tissue specificity in and around special tests of the shoulder, and the way in which he was sort of blowing this idea of impingement wide open was just fascinating. And that feels like that was maybe about 10 years ago, or it feels like maybe when I was first paying attention to it. Jim said to me, asking if I couldn't be bothered with the studio today. That's not fair, Jim. You clearly weren't tuned in at the start to hear that I'm over at my sister's because she's just had a baby, and so I'm visiting my niece. I'm an uncle for the first time, so I'm excitedly visiting them. It just so happens that we've got True South colours behind me, which is exciting. But no, I'm not in the studio, but I'm not also at my house. Right, let's have a little look at this as well. Joe Turner. Hi, Joe. Hope you're well. She said, I hope this will all foster independence amongst physios, confidence in ideas, opinions, less reliance on tradition and accepted wisdom, particularly in how we deliver care. I think that's something that I'd say on reflection of the last 10 years. I feel that that is something that I've seen wax and wane, and I don't know what my position or take is on it almost when I think about whether confidence is at a high or at a low. I think that imposter syndrome and the way in which we sort of question ourselves, it can be crippling sometimes. I feel like I personally, over the 10 years, and sort of go through these waves of which I feel like I've got my shit together, and then all of a sudden I'm struggling again, and it was an illusion when I thought had some stability. Now, you don't want to lose your foundations sometimes, and I think that that's sometimes what we find is that people blow away, or people think that the evidence moves in such a way that then blows the foundations out from under someone's practice, and we need to be cautious of that, because that's certainly something that can predate some burnout, which I think is concerning. Here's some examples I think maybe that Katie might be giving with regards to what comes back around. So Tommy Thomas was saying about the fact that traction beds and stuff like that are less common, but Katie's making the point in IDD, which isn't different, it's just more expensive. It comes back around, absolutely, I would say so. And I will also say that speaks to, I speak as a proud private practitioner, but fundamentally there's some bullshit that's able to thrive in the private sector quietly away, and that's one example where inferring relevant structural changes through fancy ass traction devices, etc., makes me concerned. Certainly, I'm not happy about that. Here's a great one from Mike James. Hi, Mike. Hope you're good. He said about lots being changing, especially one of the best things being the collaboration between the professions. That's a really recent, I'd say over the 10 years, I think that's actually got worse, and then it feels like it's getting better again. I think interprofessional tribalism became higher as social media sort of to it being amongst our world more, and then I'd say that then it started to improve and reform, I would argue, in recent times, which is really pleasing. So I'm happy with that. A great point here. So I'm going to mispronounce your surname, I'm afraid, Elizabeth, but Muche Tari. Oh, sorry, I'm not going to even try, and I'll be offensive if I try that too many times. Apologies, Elizabeth, but thank you for your comment. It's brilliant to see, because I agree with it wholeheartedly. As a lot of equipment seems to be taking over hands-on therapy as the price comes down, as interesting things that we're coming to realize we can't do with our hands, and realizing that, then sometimes gadgets and gizmos become more prevalent. They come in waves. I'm very rehab centric in my practice, admittedly, and so I'm always skeptical of machines that go bing, but the way in which robotics and wearables and things like that, and the way in which it's going to influence our care is absolutely crucial. And massive thanks for your comment there, Elizabeth. It's a great one, because I've seen that too, but for better and for worse. Right, so gadgets and gizmos that are just gimmicks, and then you've got things that are actually sensible integrated technologies are brilliant as well. So I've got 5 minutes to go. I've got to get this up from Matt Scar's book though before I do. Low hanging fruit, but the changes in understanding of communication around manual therapy. He feels that US and Canada have been ahead of the curve, but he's thrilled to be involved in the UK catching up. Now, Matt's Massage Matters podcast, so Google and get on your podcast feeds. Massage Matters did a brilliant episode about that, the changes in our understanding of what happens under our hands and how we can influence tissues. I think is something that we've got to bear in mind, and we've got to really think about the way in which that makes a difference. I think the mechanism of effect and our understanding of that is central to what has changed over the last 10 years. But I'm really biased in that direction. I think it really matters what we think is happening, or what's going on under when we deliver care, and when we're delivering treatment, especially. Like, what is it? What's the magic in the sauce, really? Like, what is going on that's actually doing the doing? Is fascinating to me, and always something that's central to my learning. And I think it makes a big difference. So I agree with you there, Matt. Is there anything I disagree with here? Let's have a little look. Evie's made a good point. Of course, virtual healthcare. Of course, that's massive change. I'd say not just over the last 10 years, but especially in recent months. It's just been exponential, and rightly so. But anyway, I'm going to cut the comments. Please do keep them coming in, but I'm going to not distract myself with that for a few minutes as I tell you a few leaks for Therapy Live Sport. On the 7th of November, for those of you that haven't heard, we're doing a smaller Therapy Live event. Still 5,000 people, so it's hardly small, but it's small compared to 22,000, which we had at the main show, which is going to be 2 or 3 feeds of education. And it's a who's who in the swim, bike, run, and triathlon fields. And so we've got sessions on, and here's some of the leaks for you. Swimmer's shoulder. We're going to have Dan Nichols from the England swimming team. He's going to be talking about the swimming shoulder and some lookouts for that. We've got a session on the ITB patients that we don't talk about with a surgeon and a physio. So Claire Robertson and Jonathan Bell, who's physio and surgeon respectively, also happen to be married. So I look forward to them getting stuck into potentially some debate points. That'll be super interesting. But that's going to be a fascinating session. ITB patients that are sort of problem recalcitrant cases, when to intervene, when not to, be that surgically or with injectables, that sort of stuff. It's going to be fascinating. We've got a session on running shoes. Like, of course, that's a hot topic. So we want to get some of the leading podiatrists in the world to sort of muse on sort of what's going on with that, what they do, what they don't do for performance, for pain, what are the challenges and issues that we face. Patients are always talking to us about that sort of thing, especially your triathlon and running patients are wanting to know what footwear they should and shouldn't be using, what the footwear can and can't do. So we're going to have a session on running shoes. Ian Griffiths and Simon Bartold already confirmed for that session. So that'll be fascinating in itself. What a brilliant panel discussion we're going to be able to have there. We have some athletes that I won't announce yet, but we've got some high-level Olympic athletes that are going to be speaking at Therapy Live, involved in panels around sort of culture of athletics, etc., but also just talking about some of their injury histories and the pros and cons of therapy and coaching and lessons learned over the years of competing at a high level and overcoming injury. We've also got medial tibial stress syndrome and describing the circumstances around that lower limb phenomenon that often described as shin splints and why that's a terrible term. We've got sessions on thoracic and periscapular pain, and I can announce that Adam Meekins will be speaking on that complex area, no doubt railing against things like massage and manipulation in and around that area, but recognizing where there is a relevance to those symptoms, when it can be serious, when not, how it can affect cyclists and swimmers, less so in runners, but cyclists and swimmers differently. So that'll be a really fascinating session in and around that scapulothoracic complex region. I think that'll do for now. I'll maybe leak some more later in the week, but trust me, just absolute who's who of speakers, but also it's all about the content and the sessions. Like, think about it that way. It's not just about getting the speakers and then think, right, well, what can they just speak on just generically? Just also, I think it's today we start announcing the sessions and speakers one by one each day. So yeah, keep an eye out on the social media feeds for that. So exciting times. It's going to be absolutely brilliant. Check out Therapy Live Sport, 7th of November. I think 2/3 of the tickets have gone now. We've actually stopped promoting it for a little while because we want to do a big promotional push, which will sell it out once we announce all the speakers and agenda and stuff like that. We've just been busy doing that. But yeah, over half the tickets sold out in 48 hours. And so check out us on Eventbrite or go to any other social media pages and you'll find all the details for getting your ticket there. Snap it up quickly because I think it'd probably be, if we're announcing the sessions, then probably it's going to be available only for a few more days, I imagine, because I think there's only about 1,500 still available. So do check that out if you want to. It's going to be really applicable to all MSK clinicians in private practice and NHS. I mean, these are the sorts of things that are principle-based, not just high-end and elite sport. We've got participation sessions about how we can help with public health in swimming, cycling, and running, a variety of different pieces from coaches, athletes, and therapists of the highest order, of course. And so I hope you enjoy that. So that's enough from me today. Many thanks for those of you that have joined to especially with me sort of wondering and pondering over the last 10 years. I think it's really interesting for us to consider how things have changed. So please do keep your comments coming in, because I think that's going to be a really interesting thing for us all to reflect on. I see some comments coming in. Thanks, Paul. I'll check that out after the stream because I need to go. I've been keeping these to time. It's been half an hour, so I better go. He's made a point here. Oh, let's just have a quick look. don't lump technologies in under the term electrotherapy. We need to be careful about that, he's saying. I think that's a fair point. But sometimes it's electrotherapeutic modalities of old, so interferential ultrasound, TENS were the classic things that we're trained in, are certainly less on vogue now compared to neuromuscular stimulation and shockwave and things like that. So yeah, it's a differing and changing market. But thanks a lot. Keep your comments coming in. Really appreciate you all, and thanks again. Tomorrow I've got Uzo Ehiog on the Ehioge, mispronounced that as well. Sorry, he's going to be on the show talking about his take on advanced practice. And it's absolutely brilliant. He's got some spicy opinions, and he's just always a brilliant thinker. And so do join me and Uzo tomorrow for chewing it over. But thanks a lot for now. If it all works well, I'll leave you with the fancy ass graphic outro, and hope that works. So you've hope it's all working. Seems to still be. So I'll love you and leave you. All right, see you tomorrow.